Thank you so much. We request everybody to please be seated for the next session. Up next, we are honored to welcome two distinguished guests today, Mr. Rohan Murty and Professor Chas Bontra, who will be engaging in a fireside chat on the topic Harnessing AI for Sustainable Development in India. Mr. Rohan Murty is the founder and CTO of Soroco, a company specializing in process discovery and automation. Mr. Murty holds a PhD from Harvard, a BS from Cornell, and was a fellow at MIT. Remarkably, during his time at Harvard, he was selected as a junior fellow, becoming only the second computer scientist in the program's 80-year history, following the legendary Marvin Minsky, the father of artificial intelligence. Moderating this session is Professor Chas Bontra, the Pro Vice Chancellor for Innovation at Oxford. Professor Chas is a leading figure in drug discovery and innovation, recognized as one of the top innovators in industry, and honored with the Order of the British Empire. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mr. Rohan Murty and Professor Chas Bontra to the stage.
Where do you want me to sit?
Well, Rohan, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? We heard a little bit about your background, but tell us a bit about yourself.
That almost feels like an interview question. Okay, I'm an academic turned entrepreneur. I come from a family where we are teachers for 7 generations. And in my generation, I was the last hope, or the last Jedi. And everyone thought I'd be a professor. I gave up academia to start a tech company. We are based primarily out of Boston, but also between India and Singapore and now London. And so I was in the UK, and Siddharth invited me saying, come to Oxford, to the business school and speak. And so here I am.
So tell me, what do you worry about in terms of AI, sustainability, India? What keeps you awake at night?
So actually before that, maybe if it's okay, let me take a slight detour in answering that, right? Why is there so much excitement around AI this time around? Because if you sort of see trends in technology, it's sort of always in waves, and the first wave may fail, the second wave may fail, finally the third wave really lands. In the 80s, there was the great hope of AI, and everybody thought that was the time when AI was really going to deliver on all the promises that Alan Turing and many others had dreamt of for computing, and it did not. And so when I was an undergraduate student, which was early 2000s, it was not very fashionable to be working on AI those days. And the difference this time around, perhaps, is that 10 years ago, AI was very much used, but it was used in ways that maybe perhaps many of us were unaware of. So if you were transacting with your bank, it was being used in the back end to find anomalies, to detect seemingly malicious transactions and so on. So it didn't really directly affect you on a regular basis, but it was there, somewhere lurking in the background. But this time around, in this current wave, I think it fundamentally changes the interface between humans and machines. And that's why everybody's grandmother here will know about or would have heard of GPT. May not know what it is, it doesn't matter, but would have heard of it. Because for the first time, it's doing something that fundamentally alters how humans and machines have a relationship. And I think that's very important to understand why it's much more real this time around than in any of its previous avatars. And so having said that, that's sort of the first thing. And the second thing is, how does it change this relationship between people and machines? Fundamentally, it changes this. It's some of these advances that have happened in the recent past have, made it. I'll use some words fairly loosely, but I don't mean to be precise. Sort of, we now have these algorithms that can understand relationships between large pieces of text, can read Faisal Devji's book and pretend to summarize it as if an intelligent person has read the book, but it's not really the case. There are some very complex relationships between words that have been deciphered and so on. But to cut a much longer story short, I think what the current avatar of what AI does is it redefines humanity's relationship with words. And that is actually an extremely fundamental point. We have not had an invention or an innovation in computing that has been this transformative in terms of changing how we think of words or our connection to words. Now, why is that important? Because most of recorded history, not all, is in words, right? Our histories are written in words, our literature is in words, our communication is, big part of it is in words, and so on and so forth. And so if that is the case, then I think the future sort of that the current wave portends is one where you start to ask things like what is real, what is fake. Turns out you can extend this argument to not just words, but to audio, to video. And so then the questions become even more urgent and pressing. What is real? What is not real? What is synthetic? What does it mean to be synthetic? I don't know. How do you take exams? What is original piece of work? I don't know. I feel like, at least in my own case, I don't have a very good answer for these kinds of questions, seeing all of the recent advances. I thought I knew, but I don't anymore.
So in the earlier conversation, Miles was saying, in talking about carbon dioxide capture and, and I agree with him. I mean, I think when we have an emergency like the climate emergency, we need to throw everything at it. The kitchen sink, we need to try everything. Green energy, biodiversity, carbon capture, everything. We should be doing it. Just like in the pandemic, nobody knew which vaccine was going to work. Many of my colleagues said we won't get a vaccine for COVID-19. Now, fortunately, we tried lots of things and we had a number of successes, but we were lucky. So I think we need to do exactly the same. I think we're not good at predicting the future. I mentioned earlier these trillion-dollar companies. I don't think there's anybody in this room who could have predicted NVIDIA would today be worth more than 3 trillion, or Apple would be, or a company that started off delivering books through letterboxes, Amazon, would be worth nearly 2 trillion. We're not good at it. So the tough question for you, Rohan, is what's this world going to look like even in 10 years, 20 years? Because we all talk about AI, it's going to impact everything, and we can talk about the sustainable development goals, etc. We can talk about the impact of AI in each of those, etc. But where do you think we're going to be in 10, 20 years' time?
I have no idea. In fact, I'll tell you, in the confines of our own company, okay, forget the world. I mean, this is a company that I started. I continue to be shocked by what I see that our teams are doing, because we've built a foundation model of a certain kind. Our model basically today behaves like it's a McKinsey consultant. If any of you are going to be an analyst or associate McKinsey, our model will do whatever you're doing. I didn't think that would happen 3 years ago. So I mean, if I can't foresee what we're doing within the confines of a young organization, I don't know where we'll be 10 or 20 years from now. It's exactly because of what you said. In fact, I'm sure we have lots of theories and hypotheses, but the pace of development, as an example, 2 years ago, I think the world had at least publicly released open source models, something like about 6 or 7,000. Today there are over 50,000. And some of these models can do really, really dramatic things. I listened to so my uncle is a professor of astrophysics at Caltech. I listened to his talk recently, and he was talking about how his group are using AI models to completely automate discovery of the night sky without a human in the loop. And this AI model is doing the discovery and then writing these papers. And if you really think about it, one of the oldest activities of humankind is to look up at the stars and wonder about our place in the universe. And we now say that we have models that can pretty much do most of these activities. So it's, I think the pace of change, particularly in this area, is so high. At least I may not have the intelligence to say what will it be 5 years or 10 years from now.
Rohan, I don't want to embarrass you. You're one of the smartest people in this room and on the planet. But sort of, if you can't give us advice on this, because the purpose of this discussion today is, I could make a case for the importance of AI in healthcare, energy, climate, food production, water, reducing pollution in air, land, sea, everything. The things I worry about with respect to AI is the energy consumption of these data centers and where that energy is going to come from. And I also worry about increased inequality. At the moment we've got massive educational inequality, income inequality, gender inequality, but there's a third of people on the planet who do not know how to use the internet, etc. So potentially the inequalities. So what do you worry about? I mean, I'm afraid my brain works. I always think about problems and then I think about solutions. So give me some problems to think about.
So a couple of things. See, for all the things that you just mentioned, right? Energy is a very legitimate one, legitimate concern, because so far the large successes we have seen have been models that require tremendous amounts of compute power to train in particular, and inference is also expensive. But there's still hope, because you're seeing, for example, a very young company with only 40 people, I think as of a few days ago valued at 6 billion, sitting in Paris, who have developed Mistral, for those of you who don't know, developed models that are quite competitive with these large models, and yet their energy footprint is much smaller, even in their training. In fact, that has been the entire value proposition, to say, look, you don't need to be energy, quote unquote, inefficient. You can actually do it with far less resources. You can be far better. So there may be some hope. When it comes to inequality of people not having asymmetric access to the internet and so on, well, if on-device AI models do succeed, which I think they will, so you're not only going to have these large models in the cloud consuming tremendous amounts of power, you'll have models on phones and so on, which don't require internet connectivity and which can be multilingual. I actually think perhaps our best chance of leveling the inequality will be these very helpful agents on these devices, these AI agents. So I tend to look at all of these and think, I don't see the future as being full of problems. I see it as being full of possibilities for each one of these things. And that doesn't mean that the concerns today are not legitimate. But I also see green shoots that suggest that maybe the future will be different. So I don't worry about it in that sense, about some of these, because to me, these are a matter of time before they get resolved.
So, I mean, I do agree with that. I mean, I think where I get my optimism from is sort of, I'm fortunate in this great university. I'm surrounded by many geniuses. Many of them are very young, and some of them are sitting in this room, and some of them are even younger than yourself, Rohan. And they are so smart and passionate and creative and entrepreneurial, etc. And that's where I get my hope. I completely buy that. So let me try and prod this another way. So one of the other reasons for this meeting is sort of, I always think working in Oxford is an absolute privilege. We've got brilliant people. We've got great brand name, we've got alumni all over the world, we've got wonderful networks, we've got geniuses like Miles working on all sorts of problems, etc., etc. We've got a brilliant business school. There's nothing we cannot do. All the problems I talked about at the start, we've got colleagues in this university working in all those areas, etc. Now, the purpose of this meeting is to think about sort of how can we in Oxford work with our friends in India to do something that's going to be step-changing, transformative, etc. You know, I would like out of this meeting, I don't just want us to go home and, you know, say, oh, we had a great time chatting with Rohan, etc. I want us to go home and think about, there's one or two things we're going to follow up on. So what are those one or two things we could do?
So let me first say something about India and then maybe tie it back to Oxford. In my limited estimation, I don't yet know if we have the talent in India, but we don't have the training in India to be able to innovate on models. At least this is what I find when I recruit people in India. America has the largest talent pool. I mean, this is nascent talent, but it's exceedingly complex, this work. It's not easy. It's not for the faint-hearted. I suspect the UK, I mean, not I suspect, I know for a fact the UK does, some parts of Europe do, but I don't think we have the requisite training to be able to, you know, say, okay, we'll iterate and build the next version of the model, the next more energy efficient model, as an example, in India. Now, of course, there's a separate debate. Do you need to do this or not? I mean, we'll put that aside just for a moment. Okay, so if you can't do that, then what can you do? What you can do is you can take any of these open source models and you can train it on a whole bunch of data. And that's how maybe you can build some use cases, you can build some competitive advantage, et cetera, and so on. And so you either need trained talent as your secret sauce, and or certainly you need data. Now, data we have plenty of in India, and I know that India also has data protection laws and so on, which in this case work to its favor. We have data from landed records to health records, of which we don't have a standardization, but nonetheless it's a great opportunity to standardize, to financial data, to pretty much everything else. And we have data at large scale and large volumes. And it turns out that is exactly of the kind or nature of what you need for these models to do quite well. They need a lot of data, and so on. And so sort of my perspective on this has been to build any kind of a play or advantage or of any kind in India with respect to AI, it has to revolve around data. It's not yet a talent play. Not in India, not yet. Again, it doesn't mean, I'm not saying, I don't want someone to think, hey, Indians can't do AI. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying. It's quite to the contrary. If you actually see the revolutionary paper in 2017 published from Google Brain, I think the two lead authors were from India, but sitting in London. I think what India can do, at least in the meantime, is to invest very heavily in curating these data sets, cleaning these data sets, training models on these data sets, and then discovering use cases of what does a trained model on these data sets, what can it do?
Let me try and have another go at this. I mean, I
feel like I'm resisting something that you wish to get towards.
Sort of, this is good. And then I want to open it up to questions, etc. So our Vice-Chancellor is a lady named Irene Tracy. Praveen knows him well. And Miles, you know her a little bit well, I think. Sort of. Absolutely brilliant lady. She did this review for our Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, which published at the end of December. It was on sort of innovation, entrepreneurship in universities and spin-outs, et cetera, et cetera. And then a couple of months ago, there was a House of Lords Select Committee, and unfortunately Irene couldn't go, so Muggins had to go. But sort of, I was asked the following question: what is the difference between the US and the UK? And I said the difference is money and culture, you know. And Let me just explore that culture bit. So my sense in the US, they have more of a moonshot culture. We're going to land somebody on the moon, we're going to cure cancer, etc., etc. We don't have that in UK, Europe. If somebody comes up with a big problem here, immediately 10 people jump on that individual and say, oh, no, you won't do that. It's too risky. You won't get the funding for it, etc. But I think the other thing I like about the US is their risk-taking, they're confident, they're ambitious. And I said earlier that the reason I'm optimistic about these problems I worry about is young entrepreneurs like the people sitting in this room. They're going to solve them. People like Rishi over there, he's going to solve them, etc. People like you. That's why I'm optimistic. But so if there was one ambitious goal that we could do together, what would it be, Rohan?
When you say we could do together, you mean Oxford in India or the UK?
UK and India, I don't mind. I don't care. I mean, I just care about bringing scale and urgency to some of these problems and bringing the right people to those problems.
So I actually think the UK has lots of right people, trained talent in AI, and India has all the data. And I think the mix of the two is where the intersection really lies. We have to find use cases now. Okay, so you have talent, you have data, okay, what can you do with the two? And we have to find use cases for these. And it can be across the board. It can be pretty much. For example, I know there are lots of folks in the Valley who work on health, training models on health data. But we have far more health data in India, except it's not yet aggregated, not yet cleaned, etc., and so on. But with the right kind of talent, partnering with the right kind of data curation in India, I think something meaningful can be done when it comes to health, when it comes to detection of various problems. I mean, that's just one of far too many examples like this. Whenever you go to register a house in India, it's not a straightforward process in terms of it's not digitized and so on. And so we have lots of land records, historical archives and land records, none of which, or rather, all of which are prime fodder for AI models. Because you often have to find the lineage for, is this property really owned by the person selling it? And you often don't know. And it turns out after you buy, years later, you're stuck in lawsuits and so on and so forth. All of which can actually be really dealt with the appropriate data being trained on the right kinds of models or the right kinds of iterations of models. So I always think of India as large data source, and you bring the right set of people in, and you can solve some problems.
So Praveen, AI, healthcare, data, India. That's your next job. Okay, so let's open it up to questions, please. Oh my goodness. Over there, that young lady there. Could we get a microphone, please? And can we make the questions brief, please?
Rohan, this is what you said about talent and training. And my question is how easy it is to commoditize anything in India, especially with regards to templatization, education, everything else. And that makes it very, very easy for AI. But you come to leadership and management, what we study here, and which is more about EI, right? The emotional quotient and emotional intelligence. So could you tell us a little more about your journey from AI to EI?
Well, according to my wife, I have not achieved that journey.
I've been married a lot longer, and I can tell you, you never achieve that journey.
So I'm not sure I have a very intelligent response to your rather thoughtful question. So yeah, I don't really know what to say.
I think that's a conversation over lunch. So can we have a microphone here, please? Second row behind Sumitra. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Hi, Rohan. I'm Jago Shetty. I'm a DPhil in medical history, and I know about the translation work that is done in the Murty Classical Library. I liked what you said about AI redefining the relationship of human beings and language. What I want to know is how can AI redefine and perhaps improve the understanding of the history of language, literature, and perhaps what is lost in translation?
That's a fantastic question. So I'll just add a little bit of context to the question that's asked. So many years ago, I started a nonprofit, which is perhaps amongst the largest translation projects in the world. It's called the Murty Classical Library of India. It's based at Harvard. What we do is we attempt to broaden the definition of classics. So now as a grad student, I happened to be sitting next to a classics professor at dinner somewhere, and then he said, classics is, he was talking about Greek and Latin. And my mother tongue is about roughly 2,000 years old. It's a language called Kannada, spoken by 60 million people in India. So I asked him, why is my mother tongue not a classic? He said, no, it actually is. It's possibly, it is. We just don't have access to the text. So one thing led to another, and ended up starting this project. We have, what we do is we take texts from about 14 different classical Indian languages: Sanskrit, Old Tamil, Old Kannada, medieval Marathi, medieval Bangla, etc., and so on, and we translate them to English. So if you open our books, on the left-hand side is the original script, the right-hand side you have the translation, and we do this for literature in these languages, in the classical forms of these languages. And the project is now roughly, actually it's about 10 years, it's 10th year of its iteration, and we want to do this for the next 90 years or so about a 100-year project. The reason your question is so interesting is that at its launch, we had launches around the world, and we had one launch here in London at the Indian High Commission in 2014, and we had this fantastic Punjabi text translated by a professor, I think at UCL, one of the schools in London, and his name is Christopher Shackle. And so Chris Shackle spent 50-odd years of his life being an expert on Punjabi literature, which was fascinating for me. I'd never met somebody like him. And so somebody at the time said, hey, you're a computer scientist. Why do you need scholars in 40 different countries doing these translations? And I remember saying, there's no technology I can think of that will be as good as Chris Shackle. Because, I mean, he's a remarkable scholar, 52 years of his life just studying Punjabi and doing these translations. Now, having said that, today, if the same question were asked, I'd probably think of it a little differently. Because I don't know if these models are at the maturity of a Chris Shackle, but they can begin to emulate a Chris Shackle in limited ways. And that's far more than what we could ever do earlier on. And so there are debates that we're having, for example, at the Classical Library Project, where we're wondering, saying, because we're doing these translations and we have these expert translators doing these things across the globe, and the left-hand side is the original script, the right-hand side is English, what happens if we feed all of this into a model? Do we, in some sense, preserve some kind of essence of these languages in these models? Because there are languages, by the way, where we are not able to find translators. Because the next generation are all people like most people in this room and myself, glasses, engineering, computer science, don't really study the classics, right? So may not know the classical forms. And so if we want to do this for the next 90 or 100 years, on some languages should we quote unquote give up and just train models? And yes, our translations will not be as good, but maybe that's the best we can do. And so there is this active debate going on at the Board of Trustees right now. In fact, they've brought in computer scientists and classicists, and they're all debating. I happen to be sitting in through one of these meetings listening in, and the classicists were, of course, saying to the computer scientists, saying, oh, but this translation is nothing like the scholarly translations we do. And they're right, but we may have no choice. And that is, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that was not even a considered option, which it is now. Right? And so we'll have to see.
Third.
Dhananjay Thackeray from India. So when we talk about sustainable development in India, and especially about the grassroots development, so it depends on the critical demographics, geography of India, which you know. So how the AI can help in this, because it depends on the sampling, surveys. Even if we do it manually, we find errors. How AI can help in it, and what are the gaps, challenges, and solutions in this?
For me, the most important thing it can do at any grassroots anywhere is level education, more than anything else. Perhaps health too, but I've not thought about health enough, but certainly on education. You can bring uniformity to understanding or to explanation of information in a way that we previously just could not. See, today you have Wikipedia, right? And so if you have it really depends on the reader and the context of the reader to be able to understand it well enough. And so information is useful, but not enough. Whereas if you want to make any change at grassroots, my first bet would be on education.
Hi, Rohan.
Last question.
Last question. Rohan,
I know, Wasim. You can ask me a question offline, Wasim. You don't even need to ask the question here.
no, but there is something which you don't answer sometimes. This is public, you're supposed to answer.
Keep it brief, please.
Simple question. Why did you choose what you chose to do? You could choose anything in the world when you passed out of college. So why did you choose to be doing what exactly you're doing in Soroco? Secondly, how you're applying or harnessing AI? Because you are supposed to be a very big advocate of AI. So how these two things you thought about and you're actually doing it?
Great question. So, very specifically, just to give some context, what I found, I'm very inspired by manufacturing. I think all those folks who do anything in computing should look towards manufacturing for more lessons. We tend to have this artificial distinction that somehow computing is the future and a lot of these industries with their hands are the past. I don't quite buy that. What I find fascinating about manufacturing is it's taken us 100 years to develop a disciplined way of building things, right? You can take any large complex object, whether you're sending it into space or a car, break it down to a million little parts, assembly line, etc., and you have a detailed discipline for doing this. In fact, there are departments in universities, operations research, industrial engineering, that study all of these things. But when it comes to office work, which is what a majority of people here in this room do, where we use some computing device for doing our work, whether you're in a bank or a retail company, whatever it is, we tend to think that's very different. And there's no rigor or scientific way for understanding office work, for understanding what's wrong with it. And that always struck me as rather remarkable. The best guess that we have had for 40 years is to hire consultants. They'll come, you have an instinct, they'll ask a few people a few questions, and then they'll tell you what's wrong and what to fix. And so what I found very interesting was, how do I create a science of work, how we work? I felt not that I felt, I know for a fact, there is no science for office work. And so I saw an opportunity to take some of the work that I had done in academia with a little bit more effort to be able to create a fundamental scientific basis for understanding and improving office work. And I thought, hey, this is great. I get to do some academic work and build a product out of it and maybe have some impact in the world with it. And so that's why I decided to leave academia to start a company.
So I think we need to finish there. The time is up. I'll just make a couple of comments. Firstly, I mentioned earlier, some of you may have heard me, that my mother had a stroke 3 weeks ago. And so she's now stopped talking, and she's hopefully starting to talk. And, for somebody who's had a mother for 63 years and she's nagged me every day for 63 years, and then she stops talking, it's quite hard. So when I go and see her in the evening, I often think what could I do? Because she is trying to talk. And what could I do to help facilitate, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just another example of how this technology skill set, I think, is going to completely change all walks of our life. The final comment is, look, I absolutely love my job, and I love my job because I meet so many truly brilliant people. And increasingly, these truly brilliant people are very, very young. And Rohan, you're another one on the list. So thank you. Please, can I ask you all to applaud them?